It is my pleasure to introduce a colleague and our friend here at the Force Center, Anita Sundrani, who is going to be presenting um, some really important work that she has done on social justice math. Anita is a research associate here at the Force Center. She earned her doctorate in curriculum and instruction at the University of Houston, where her research explored mathematics educators noticing in online spaces when planning and enacting equity-focused mathematics lessons. She's really interested in, and her research interests include social justice mathematics, teacher decision-making in online spaces, and community-engaged mathematics teaching. Prior to her doctoral studies, Anita was a high school mathematics teacher and a project-based learning coach. And it's a pleasure to introduce her as she will be talking on the topic of designing social justice math lessons, secondary school mathematics teachers' decision-making with digital curriculum materials. So I'm going to turn it over to Anita. And thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that lovely introduction. I am going to share my screen. Please let me know if you have any issues seeing it.
We can see it.
Lovely. Great. So hello again, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anita Sundrani. I want to thank you all for being here for my talk on designing social justice math lessons, and specifically secondary mathematics teachers' decision-making with digital curricular materials. I want to begin by actually situating myself in the work that I do, because the motivation for my work and the reason why it's so exciting to explore is really based on my own lived experiences and the types of work that I really engaged in as a teacher. So I am a second-generation Muslim American cisgender woman. Both of my parents immigrated from Pakistan in the 1980s. I grew up in a largely white middle class community, and my schooling reflected a westernized approach that didn't always mesh with my own cultural values or experiences. So for instance, my teachers included assignments in contexts that I wasn't necessarily familiar with, such as those that revolved around Christian holidays, but then often expected me to excel, particularly in mathematics and science. And I was able to succeed academically and became a high school math teacher myself. While I always strive to be responsive to my students' needs and lived experiences in my interactions with them, my mathematics content instruction did not necessarily do the same. It wasn't until I began teaching at a project-based learning high school and pursuing my doctoral degree that I became more aware of asset-based approaches that centered students' lived experiences and a commitment to teaching math for social justice. As a math teacher, educator, and researcher now, I understand that my various identities have really shaped my perspectives on education, and aspiring and in-service teachers bring their own unique perspectives that can positively impact students. I recognize the privileges that I've been afforded in my academic experiences due to the identities that I hold, and take opportunities to learn from and with teachers. And so I approach this research with in-service teachers through an asset-based lens, attempting to understand their motivations and decisions surrounding teaching mathematics for social justice. So in thinking about social justice, but also more largely towards culturally responsive frameworks and anti-bias resources, they're becoming a lot more commonplace throughout the United States. And teachers are increasingly seeking content from the internet as they plan their lessons, both in terms of social justice math and writ large. And this is despite the fact that curricular policies are already in place for teachers across states, districts, and schools that specify potentially a list of approved or mandated curricular materials, such as textbooks, curricula, and district-level created materials. State and district-level standards and policies, though, continue to change, and based on legislative decisions and best practices that are learned from the education field. Yet these updates to curricular materials may not necessarily reflect the updated mathematics standards, or may not be provided in time for implementation. For example, California adopted the Common Core State Standards in Mathematics in 2010, but did not approve a list of recommended materials until 2014. So district schools and teachers were left to find alternate curricula for their mathematics courses. Enter online spaces. So we have this proliferation of teachers moving to online spaces. And as a result, they talk about a lot of aspects that they're able to improve upon once they're in these spaces. They speak to improved content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, increased self-efficacy to teach mathematics and other subject areas. They talk about having more access to resources to teach social justice and equity issues. They have more relationships with educators, not just in their buildings, but in online spaces. And they're able to engage with new curricular ideas. Now, that is tempered by the fact that a lot of these materials are not necessarily vetted. And so there is potential harm that could come to students as a result of using these materials from online spaces that haven't necessarily been quality checked, which then means that some of these materials may be inaccurate, they may not be developmentally appropriate, they may actually uphold harmful stereotypes instead of breaking them down, or they may not be standards aligned, since the United States does not necessarily follow the same set of standards across the board. Now, despite all of these potential issues, there are teachers who successfully teach social justice math. What is social justice math? So it has two goals. That is freedom from oppression through developing mathematical literacy, and then also the freedom to act upon and impact the world through personal and social transformation. And teaching math for social justice really differs from other equity-based math instruction, as viewing socio-cultural contexts through a lens of power, and then also responding to social injustices. So we can see both a combination of mathematics pedagogical goals as well as social justice goals that are interwoven to help students learn how to read and write the world with mathematics. When I went to the literature base to start to get an understanding of the use of social justice context in mathematics and how online spaces are represented in those studies, I noticed that there are online spaces often mentioned in these studies, but they're not the focus. So there will be indications of using Twitter or using videos and articles from online spaces, but that's not the actual focus of the studies at large. So there's a huge opportunity to really understand what teachers are making sense of as they're looking at these materials, and then how they're choosing to use those materials. So the purpose of the study that I explored for my dissertation was to understand secondary mathematics teachers' decision-making processes when choosing SJM content from online spaces. Now, I did this within this larger context of understanding that curriculum is so broad, and curriculum takes the form of a lot of different things, as you can see in this chart. There's a lot going on. There's the official curriculum that is handed down by states and districts through designated curriculum, what your standards might be, standardized exams. But then there's what the teachers are actually doing in their classrooms. So how are they planning? How are they then implementing the lessons that they are creating or adapting? And then how does that influence student outcomes? For the purpose of this study, I really zeroed in on teacher-intended curriculum, so what they were doing during the planning stage of their lesson planning process and the factors that influence the teacher's intended curriculum. So to do this, I used two frameworks, which I'll briefly go over. And the first of which is the 3 dimensions of social justice mathematics created by Carrie Coca. The model is made up of 3 different dimensions: critical, dominant, and affective. Each has 3 goals embedded for a total of 9. These dimensions do work independently, but are also interconnected. So for instance, if we look at like the dominant pedagogical goals dimension, here we're prioritizing skills in, our normal ways, right? How are students going to be successful economically? How are they going to participate in society? And also recognizing that mathematics is a powerful and relevant tool for understanding complicated real-world phenomena. The critical dimension still emphasizes dominant mathematics, but also recognizes that there are other forms of mathematics that can also be utilized to understand the world and make sense of real-world issues, and simultaneously investigating power relations, resource inequities, and disparate opportunities among social groups. So, and this involves both awareness of these injustices and inequities, but also an action component. So what do we do about these issues? Now, what I really appreciated about this framework is that there's also an affective dimension, which really deals with students' emotions and how are they feeling about dominant mathematics, i.e. like math anxiety, but also more generally about social inequities, school, themselves, families, their relationships, and so on. And there's also a component of thinking about trauma-informed healing here. So here we're really identifying and processing emotions to then take action. And in this way, the affective pedagogical goal really supports the other dimensions. And then I also used a curricular noticing framework developed by Diedeker et al., which addresses like the planning phase of curriculum enactment. So here, what I'm really thinking about is what are teachers really attending to? What is it that they're seeing in online spaces? What is it that they're searching for? And then thinking about how they're interpreting those materials. So what are the questions they're asking of themselves? How are they digesting it? How are they connecting these different materials to each other? And then how do they respond to these materials that they're seeing in online spaces? So are they adapting it? Are they actually choosing to use it? How are they manipulating? How are they sequencing it all? So there's this whole rich environment of what's happening in a teacher's mind as they're planning. And so part of my goal here was to start to parse out all of these different components. So the study itself was guided by two research questions. One was, in what ways do pedagogical goals influence secondary mathematics teachers' decision-making processes to plan and or supplement their curriculum in critical ways? And then how do these teachers attend to, interpret, and respond to digital resources when planning social justice math lessons? I recruited 3 participants, either through word of mouth or through social media. They all identified as women, 2 of whom were white and 1 is Asian. They all have different levels of experience with teaching. 2 were in a high school setting and 1 in a middle school environment. All 3 were located in an urban environment as well. They are also in different regions geographically, and one of the teachers, Abby, is in a state that explicitly has a critical race theory ban. The research existed in 2 different phases. And so the first phase was really for me to start to build trust with my teachers. And so I could understand who they are, what their contexts are, what were their motivations, and experiences with teaching mathematics for social justice. After I had a feel for that and had a chance for the teachers to actually interact with each other and meet each other as well, we moved into the lesson planning phase, where I asked teachers to plan a social justice math lesson and reflect on the process itself. So here I really try to understand more about what are the decisions that the teachers were making and what led them to those decisions, and then also put them in a space together again so that they could talk amongst themselves about the decisions they made and ask for other resources, which really made for a really rich conversation, which we'll come back to later in the presentation. I won't really go too much into the data analysis, but if anyone is curious, we can talk a little bit more about it at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. But I did look at each teacher's data, looking at their lessons and everything else through an individual lens, but then also across the cases as well, so that I could get a better understanding of what were some similarities or differences between the teachers' approaches. So let's talk a little bit about what the lessons actually were, which I'm sure we're all really excited to hear a little bit more about. So starting with Nicole, which is a self-chosen pseudonym, defines social justice as learning and discussing issues related to race, gender, wealth, perceived ability, disabilities, etc., in society. Keeping this definition in mind, she investigated wealth distribution in the United States with her students. And she actually got this lesson from an existing text entitled High School Mathematics Lessons to Explore, Understand, and Respond to Social Injustice, but then used online spaces to supplement this existing static lesson. So some of her pedagogical goals were really to help her students interpret data from graphical representations. Her critical pedagogical goals came from a website called Learning for Justice. They have a list of social justice standards, which is broken up by age band. So you can read those here. And then her affective pedagogical goal was for her students to feel shock and anger when learning about wealth inequities along gender and race lines, leading to a desire to make a change. So the lesson itself involved opportunities for her students to understand wealth inequities and income distribution through videos and articles. And then she had an explicit focus on looking at different graphical representations to start to parse all of that out with her students. So most of the online spaces were explored by Nicole offline, or not offline, but prior to the lesson. And then those materials were presented to her students in the moment. So here, what I've created is something called a pedagogical goal sequence. So I went through Nicole's different pedagogical goals and went through her lesson planning process in a chronological order. So what was her first consideration when she sat down to lesson plan through the end of her lesson planning process? So you'll notice that she considered each dimension separately: affective, critical, dominant, and then looked at all three together, as denoted by these plus signs here. Interestingly, she bookended her lesson planning process with affective conditions. So she really thought about like how her students were going to receive this topic of wealth distribution based on like who in her classroom might be housing insecure or come from different income levels. So how are her students going to react to these things? But then also, how would she be able to understand and pick up on some of those cues? So she was looking at these types of things at both ends. Betsy's social justice definition was a lot more succinct, and it was making all my students feel seen. As a note, this was her first ever social justice math lesson, and she began it with the topic on racial demographics by school, and then detailed each of her own pedagogical goals in her own words as listed here. So she really wanted her students to be able to set up proportions with demographic percentages to calculate school enrollment by race. She wanted her students to notice how diverse their school was compared to others, and then how that might lead to other differences like school funding. And then also for her students to start to wonder why their school might be more diverse than others. So to engage in this work, Betsy provided her students with a worksheet that guided them through exploring their state school report card website, and then compared their school's composition and resources to another of their own choice. Her pedagogical goal sequence was really guided by the dominant pedagogical goal and then led right into the critical dimension to link with the dominant dimension. And so she looked at each of these things separately, but then looked at them together. And then the affective dimension was really considered after everything else had been kind of planned out. So how could she mitigate for, say, math anxiety for some of her students who she would describe as more struggling? Abby's situation was a little bit different. She spoke to not just social justice, but critical pedagogy as well. And that is because she is a doctoral student in a mathematics education program and considers herself to be a critical scholar. So when thinking about social justice, she thought about it in conjunction with critical pedagogy and stated that critical pedagogy is a way of using disciplinary knowledge to lift the veil on inequities, and social justice is the action we can take from our enlightenment. I do think about them cyclically. So in knowing this was her definition, the lesson Abby decided to craft was how to do your taxes. So she had her students calculate percentages, use order of operations, compute gross and net pay wages, to understand the impact of tax structure on different groups in our society, and then also to get upset and angry about the current tax system in the US and strive for change through voting and writing senators. So here, what she did was she utilized like the math software Desmos for her students to explore the relationship between income and taxes, and provided resources for her students to learn about the ways the tax system is set up for different types of employment structures. So looking at small business owners versus, say, like salaried employees. So it's also important to note that both Abby and Betsy designed their lessons from scratch and solely used online spaces to do that, as opposed to Nicole, who started with a static lesson. For Abby's pedagogical goal sequence, you'll notice that it's very similar to Betsy's, except that the critical and dominant dimensions were the opposite. So Abby here began with her social justice topic and then started thinking about the dominant pedagogical goals that would fit in with the context that she wanted to explore with her students. Then she looked at both the dominant and critical goals simultaneously, and then considered the affective dimension at the end. So in her case, she was really interested to see, like, what are some discussion norms that she could put into place so that her students would engage with each other in respectful ways. So let's start getting into some of the findings themselves. So in what ways were the pedagogical goals influencing the teachers' decision-making processes as they were planning their lessons? So I saw a lot of indications of the teachers coming back to their math objectives over and over again throughout the lesson planning process, but also keeping the relevant context in mind throughout as well. So you can see that through throughout the pedagogical goal sequence, right? Coming back to each and seeing them kind of in equal senses. The teachers also did look at and recognize and address emotions related to dominant and critical pedagogical goals, but they did so at differing times, right? So Nicole looked at these goals at the beginning and end, whereas the other two teachers really looked at it at the end of their lesson planning process. So, so how do the teachers attend to, interpret, and respond to these digital resources? So what was it that they were seeing? What was it that they were searching? What was it that they were attending to? So you'll notice that the teachers really focused in on making sure there was some kind of connection between the math objective and social justice idea as per their search terms. Abby and Nicole already knew their exact topic, so they looked to insert a math objective or key phrase with the social justice topic together. Whereas Betsy used something a little bit more broader, just ratios and social justice. There were also similarities and differences in where Abby and Nicole were really focused on, like in looking for articles or moments where they could add layers of knowledge to be built in online spaces so that it could be used as a vehicle to move the mathematics forward. So Betsy, however, was looking for online spaces where the math was just completely embedded there. Whereas there was a little bit of nuance with Abby doing a little bit of both, and Nicole mostly using things with her students in a whole group setting, which I'll talk a little bit more about. There's also a focus on the kinds of media that were presented. So were we looking at videos, articles, pictures of graphs, or some kind of other visual representation in that way? So there was a lot of mixed media being presented. And in terms of the pedagogical goals that were really prioritized during this phase, was a focus on dominant and critical, as stated earlier. Now, the affective dimension was not present in the conversations I had with my participants, and that could be that the affective dimension was present, just didn't necessarily come up during conversation or during their reflections. So then after they attended to these different materials, how did they interpret them? So the teacher spoke a lot about spending time comprehending the curricular materials. And so could they understand what they were hoping to present to their students? Because if they didn't understand it, they didn't know how they would make sure that their students could understand it. So for instance, they asked themselves, do I understand what these resources are even saying to be able to use them in my classroom? From there, they also referenced knowledge of their students. So what was it that they felt their students would be able to comprehend? What kinds of questions would they ask? And what could they see their students actually engaging with or not engaging with? And then also the ways in which they could see their students engaging in those things as well. So there's a lot of like meta questioning happening here about knowledge of their students, both in terms of them being individuals, but also in their understanding of mathematics. And this connects back to the attending phase, right? Because the teachers were thinking about the modalities and the types of materials a little bit, and there was a little bit more unpacking of that during this phase. So there's a lot going on this slide, but essentially what I really want to look at here is that I mentioned there were moments during the pedagogical goal sequences where each of the teachers looked at the different goals simultaneously. And so for Nicole, she looked at all three together. And so here's a quote that I think really helps to make sense of that. So she was asking, what is the math telling us? What are the graphs telling us? Let's talk more about like the implications of this. So highlighting the critical, and then I do a check-in with the students after the lessons. So you can see all three of these ideas and dimensions coming through. Whereas with Betsy and Abby, there was more of a discussion going back and forth between just the dominant and critical dimensions. Whereas Betsy was talking about, I knew the most realistic thing I could think of using was proportions or ratios. And I was like, okay, how can I make this more relevant to the students? And so I saw on Radical Math, they did something pretty similar, except they did it based off of food insecurity. And with Abby, you can see that another way I'm thinking about this is with the Desmos applet. And you have an income slider up here, so you can kind of slide back and forth and have individual graphs. So you can see as income goes up, how does the tax change? And I want my students to see that and ask why, think about why, and make sense of why. So you can see that they are all prioritizing pedagogical goals, but in different ways, but still simultaneously. So then what actually made it into these lesson plans? So selecting, sequencing, and adapting curricular materials really differed between the teachers based on what kinds of materials they entered into the process with. So Nicole, who began with a static lesson, used resources that would supplement her existing lesson, and she sequenced and adapted them so that they would align well with the static materials. Whereas without that anchor, Betsy and Abby were really doing all of these things simultaneously because they had to craft their lesson from scratch. The excluded materials were really a consequence of the previous two phases, right? What was the type of media that was presented? Could the teachers themselves comprehend the materials, and what they knew about their students? And so for instance, what they knew about their students, Abby pointed to her school being pretty left-leaning. So she knew that if she used a certain site that often looked at right-leaning perspectives, they would not receive that well. So she decided not to use resources from that lens. And now in terms of the responding phase, despite an earlier focus on dominant and critical pedagogical goals, by the end of the lesson planning process, all three of the dimensions were taken into account, though the affective dimension considerations mostly happened offline. So the teachers did not use online spaces to address the affective lens. So Nicole crafted her temperature checks with her students on her own. Abby set up the discussion norms based on her own understandings of how to set those up. And Betsy thought about her previous experiences with her students on math anxiety and what kinds of scaffolded experiences would help to mitigate for that. So aside from these two research questions, there were some larger findings that I noticed as well that I would like to go through here briefly. So one of the major findings of the study was that there was differing uses or differing purposes for relying on online spaces for lesson planning. So as stated earlier, Abby and Betsy planned their entire lessons using digital materials, whereas Nicole started with an existing resource and then planned to supplement around that. And one of the reasons Nicole pointed to moving to online spaces, though, was so that she could provide more localized and updated data for the problem she wanted her students to investigate, which is a common refrain from a lot of teachers who try to engage in this work. How does this work for my students? And then the educators did vary in their intentions with online spaces. Abby and Betsy really wanted to make sure that they engage their students in the online spaces, i.e. through Desmos and the school report card website, whereas Nicole presented everything to her students in whole group settings. And so there is also a common refrain that social justice math lessons focus more on social justice and not enough on math. And here we see a really clear example of having an active focus on both simultaneously. Race also came up, and each of the teachers here had a certain level of competency with understanding anti-racism. And so they tried to center marginalized perspectives, including Abby, who was in a state with an active CRT ban, which was really, really interesting to see. And the way they did this was just by being cognizant of the racial and ethnic makeups in their classrooms and making connections between their SJM content and who their students are. Now, I will say the only teacher who moved from awareness of injustices to action was Abby, who provided opportunities for her students to write to senators, whereas the other two teachers really stayed in this awareness realm. And then lastly, with the affective lens, we're seeing that there is a consideration of affective components, but this may have been a consequence of me bringing that into the study explicitly with the teachers. So how might that come into play without that is an interesting note. So I'll kind of move into the implications and then open it up to questions. So here we're seeing this kind of inherent understanding of the intertwined nature of social justice math dimensions. And so there may be ways for educators to make meaningful decisions, thinking about all of these things simultaneously. But regardless of the teacher's experience levels with SJM lessons, there was a necessity for them to have kind of a scaffolded approach. Abby and Betsy did talk a little bit about being overwhelmed, about having to do all of this on their own, whereas Nicole was able to kind of look at all of this as potentially as a result of already having something to build off of. So she was able to look at things a little bit more in a little bit more of a relaxed way to be able to supplement. And that could be addressed by relying on colleagues and experts. So there are lots of different opportunities via professional development or engaging online, say in social media spaces like Twitter, for teachers to be able to learn a little bit more about social justice math lessons. And so with that, here are my references, and thank you so much. I am happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Anita, for your presentation. It was super interesting. Nice to hear about your work. I'm curious, based on what you were learning, you kind of started earlier in your presentation thinking about pre-service teachers. And I'm curious how you've been thinking about, your study in relation to teacher preparation for pre-service teachers, and what sorts of implications you think the different dimensions you were looking at for teacher planning might have for methods courses, for example.
Right. So I think that a lot of the hesitation around social justice math is around how. What is it and how do you do it? And so what I think a really great opportunity here is that this framework that I used for social justice math clearly articulates that there are different dimensions that you need to look at and kind of contend with simultaneously. And so it kind of, to use one of my participants' language, lifts the veil on kind of some of that ambiguity with social justice math. And so I think being able to explicitly reference these different dimensions in methods courses can be helpful for pre-service teachers to start to get a sense of like, oh, okay, so I'm really thinking a lot about the social justice here, but where really is the high quality mathematics in all of this? And it also leads teacher educators to then also think about those considerations as well, right? And in certain cases, it may be that these teacher educators already have experience with this. And so it kind of falls into the background and you're not really thinking about it. But on the other end of the spectrum, it could be a co-learning experience for everyone involved because, thinking again about assets, pre-service teachers come from a lot of different backgrounds, and this could be a really fantastic opportunity to rely on the assets and especially from communities of color, right? So what are my own experiences and how do those show up or don't show up in the math classroom? And how can I create opportunities for that to happen in ways that I'm supported by lots of different folks? So I think that that's definitely one thing to do. And there's another part about, and I said it kind of casually, right? Like high quality mathematics, but that's a really hard thing to do as well. So there are some like really lovely tools that already exist that's kind of like in a checklist form or a rubric where you can kind of check off, like, I'm looking at this resource. How do I know? Like, I need to check to see, is it accurate? Is it at a algebra in terms of a high school level versus algebraic thinking at like an elementary school level? What kinds of thinking are students engaging in? Are they just filling in blanks versus are they engaging in like higher order cognitive processes? So there are tools also in place to really focus on that high quality mathematics part too, so that it's not getting pushed aside in favor of exploring the injustice, but how can we really do both simultaneously and use both to increase our awareness and our understanding of mathematics simultaneously.
Thank you, Anita, I can see a lot of work you did.
Thank you.
My question is there any opportunity for the participants to discuss with each other, kind of
Yes.
find out maybe even new approaches or even disagreements for some cases? If you have anything like that, I'd like to hear about it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for asking that question, because it was one of the more exciting interactions I had with the teachers too. We did engage in a focus group together, a larger conversation together about how their lesson planning process went. And it turned out that Betsy's lesson aligned really well with a lesson that Nicole had done in the past. So it opened up the conversation, I mean, beautifully, because Betsy introduced her lesson and then Nicole was like, oh yeah, I've done something like that. And immediately Betsy launched into like 7 questions so that she could get a better understanding of like, okay, so how did it go with the students? Were they engaged? What kinds of resources did you use? What other advice can you give me? And so Nicole started putting into the Zoom chat different resources that she used. And so from there, it made it really easy to think about like, okay, so since we're already talking about resources, what are other resources that everyone is using? So all of a sudden we have this chat filled with like different resources that the teachers kind of pointed to. And I really approached this as, again, like a co-learning experience too. I taught social justice math, but I am by no means an expert. And so I learned a few things from them. And I also offered different ways to kind of like do check-ins and work with students in real time too. And so we were able to kind of curate this list of resources that were then sent out to the teachers at the end. So using resources like Radical Math, and the social Learning for Justice website. Also thinking about, if you've ever heard, there's this other resource called Slow Reveal Graphs, where you can take existing graphs and basically make them naked. So you take out all of the different things and you have students engage with like, what do you see here? How could you engage in it? And you slowly reveal more and more information. And they loved that. And it's one of my favorite things to do too. And so it was a really great opportunity for all of us to be in community with each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anita, I really appreciate your presentation, and I appreciate the two questions that were just asked, both how do the teachers learn in community and engage, and what does this all mean potentially for pre-service training or ongoing professional learning? I wonder, sort of in that learning community that you built with the three teachers, did they discuss, or did you discuss with them what they were learning about the students' reactions, and if I leap to sort of outcomes of social justice math? I mean, it gets to the tension of math and social justice, and how do we do both?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, were they finding that in doing these lessons and learning about their pedagogy that they were also engaging students more, or were they leading to higher outcomes? I'm curious what they found were the students' reactions to all of this.
Right. So I'll speak a little bit to Abby and Nicole because so the study itself was just the planning phase. And so then we kind of ran up against the end of the school year. And so, I still need to hear more about the actual, like how the lessons were received by their students. But in terms of previous lessons, Abby has constantly run up against her students not being engaged. And so she was envisioning that these social justice contexts would make her students more interested in engaging in the mathematics itself. And so she kind of spoke to a little bit of both, like there were some students who would get engaged in the context, but not necessarily the math, or in other senses, like there would be a little bit of both. Like some students who were interested in both, like they were interested in the context, so they were interested in engaging in the math with it. And there are still students who were just completely disengaged. And that's just a consequence of, I'm sure a number of things. Her school has a large refugee population. And so there are a lot of different languages and experiences that were present in her classroom. So there were a lot of different things that she was kind of grappling with simultaneously. So engagement, she was hoping, would be higher, like with this lesson in particular, because taxes is something that affects anybody, right? And so so she was really hopeful that the context would invite students into the mathematics itself. And with Nicole, she, I think, has done a really great job of building trust with her students. And this is actually her second year teaching some of the same students. So she was thinking about her knowledge of her students from the previous year too. So they had already done a lesson on gender inequalities with income. So this felt like a really good continuation of that lesson, because she saw that there were a lot of students who were engaged, including one student who generally was not engaged in mathematics, but he was so engaged in like the context that he was like, I'm going to make the math work for me? And this is like a previous lesson, the gender pay gap one. So the biggest question is just constantly, are the students going to be engaged? And so social justice contexts were the way that they were hoping to engage their students. So because they had seen prior success versus not embedding those kinds of real world contexts. So they didn't speak necessarily to what the outcomes were academically, but through engagement and motivation, there were definitely increases in outcomes or improvements in outcomes.
As I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the fact that your participants all came from secondary classrooms, which are presumably subject specific. And so I immediately jumped to self-contained elementary classrooms. And I was curious what your thoughts are, if you don't mind speculating a little bit, on how teaching social justice math might feel different in a classroom where educators might, like, for example, like see it as an opportunity to do something more multidisciplinary, and would that be more challenging, more helpful? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And there are lots of talented folks who are researching exactly that. In fact, that book that I displayed that Nicole used, it's part of a series, and the series spans from early elementary through high school. So there's a book for early elementary and like grades 3 through 5. So it's kind of opening up the arena to thinking about social justice in those contexts, and especially because a lot of elementary school teachers also have their own math anxiety and may not have many opportunities in their teacher preparation programs to engage in math methods. Usually there's like one course in their studies that deal with mathematics teaching. And so I think that social justice math provides a different lens for elementary school teachers too, right? So that you're not just seeing math as these numbers that are difficult to like manipulate or make sense of, but to do so with context that deal with real world issues that are really pressing too, I think helps to kind of release a little bit of that math anxiety itself. And these different lessons are always interdisciplinary, right? So there are opportunities to engage with other subject areas, and especially at the elementary school level, since there is an overlap, right? Like there are multiple subjects being taught simultaneously. There are definitely those opportunities. I wish I could speak to a little bit more about how those lessons are like fair in the math class or like the elementary classroom when thinking about math. But that's definitely an area that I need to look up a little bit more and would be interested to learn more about too.
I have what I think is a quick question, which is how often is this top down from the school versus the teacher's own initiative in taking up social justice themes in their curricular planning?
So it really depends on the school. And I also think that the climate has changed a lot since COVID. I left the classroom in May 2020. So the opportunities to do that may look a little different now versus prior to the pandemic. And I can't really speculate in which way, if there's more freedom or less freedom for teachers to explore these kinds of issues. But it also kind of depends on how teachers are evaluated too. So at my project-based learning high school, we were expected to use a driving question that is based on some kind of real world situation or problem for students to investigate. And so from there, it was a really easy leap to think about social justice, because that could just be the driving question, like, let's explore this injustice. and use mathematics to kind of like look into it. But for other teachers whose schools may have mandated curricula, right? So you're expected to do this lesson on this day with everybody else simultaneously so that we can keep track of students' progress in a way that is easier to manage and to be able to catch when there are, comprehension issues or whatever else, so that we can set students up for success academically. There may not be as much room to do that. And so I think that that's a really important question, though, that needs to be explored with a lot of different thought partners, right? So what is the balance between that academic success, but also engaging in some of these problems that do feel a little squishy too, because it's like, are we really answering that question, or are we just kind of exploring it to better understand it and possibly come up with actions? But then also, how much space do we have to come up with actions and actually do act on them, right? So I think that there's a lot of negotiation that needs to be involved, and there's no one size fits all situation either. And so it's highly contextualized to the environment, and engagement is another big thing. So if you're doing social justice work and students aren't taking it up, what does that mean? And how can you pivot because of, say, there might be a difference in demographics of the students. So different issues might interest different students, but also then, and quick response, but but there's also okay, so at what point do we say they're not interested in this because they haven't been exposed to this before, versus what is it that they're interested in because they've experienced it? So there's also that kind of negotiation that needs to happen within the classroom if there's space to do this work too. So lots of really interesting areas to explore.
Totally. I think we have time for one last question if anyone has one.
Going to make just a quick statement, sort of a wish in the world, and I don't know if this is possible, but I mean, thinking about framing questions with a social justice perspective is fantastic. It's really great, but then to think about the mainstream curricular providers and who base their development of curriculum on what sells in Texas, what sells in Florida, what sells in California, the big states. It's a balancing act in the political side. So it's going to be interesting to see how work like yours builds up more work like yours, so that then this becomes not something special or extra or controversial, but actually part of the new status quo.
I mean, that is a lovely way to say it, because and I love that as a concluding remark, right? Because this is also just kind of almost a call to action for ourselves, right? How do we identify what these different tensions are and work through these tensions, and not necessarily find again an answer that fits everyone simultaneously, but how can we kind of engage in these questions constantly and come back to them too?
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Anita. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining and for your questions. And we will see you hopefully in 2 months. We're skipping December for our brown bag series. So the next one will be January 23rd at this same time, noon Central. And we hope to see you there. All right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yep. Bye, everyone.
Everybody, thanks for coming.